Well, Don, I thought it'd be nice to spend a little bit of time talking about Dad and his interest in art. And maybe you could recall when you first heard about Dad going into the advertising business and what was sort of going on through the family. How were people reacting to it?
He had been working his way up to this. He did a lot of the cartoons for the Saturday Evening Post. And of course he was in the advertising department of the Sheboygan Press. And then he decided one day that was it. And he went down and started his own place in his garage and got started growing. And they finally put a studio upstairs in the garage. And it was phenomenal. It was exciting. I know that my mother was very, very excited about it because she had written to me about it. And Val, of course, had notified me that what was happening. But Charlie was out in Arizona. And see, he went into service in 1946. And of course, Frank, I think, was out of service then. And I think he was in New York going to school. And then he came to Wisconsin, to Milwaukee, to Layton School of Art, where he met his wife, Betty Brock, a wonderful lady. We lived out in a log cabin out in the leather camps in Stevens Point, Wisconsin, just out of Stevens Point, Wisconsin. And he used to help in the logging woods, and he helped with the pulpwood. And then we moved back to Stevens Point in about 1933. And he became very interested in art. And he did a lot of cartoons. And we had a dairy company there that called Fairchild. And he did painted all the trucks. And it was difficult for him to do it because he did shake quite a bit. But he did that, and he attended college there. Then he went to Layton School of Art, and from there he met his wife. And as I understand it, of course I was gone to the Army, but I understand he went out to California, Long Beach, California. He got involved in art out there. Then, as I understand it, he came back and went to Sheboygan Press. And from there, he decided he was going to go on his own. And he has started this fantastic organization in about 1960. And from there, it's done nothing but go ahead. You know, it was a very strange thing happened. Frank had been out at Long Beach, California, working with the Flying Fortress Project, and I thought that that's where he was, while I was at Fort Benning, Georgia, going to jump school. Well, one morning a fellow from Merrill, Wisconsin, came to me and he said, "Jake, I want to introduce you to somebody." So what happened was he took me over to the next platoon and he introduced me to my brother Frank. And that was really a surprise because I never thought that he was going to be in service. When I asked him what happened, he says, "Well, I just couldn't stand it to be out there. I had to get into this and be a part of it," which I thought was very admirable of him. And while we were jumping, one day he jumped and he landed wrong. It was a mock aircraft, and you just jumped about 4 or 5 feet. But he jumped a little bit wrong, and I laughed. And when I laughed, the jump sergeant made him drop down and do 20 push-ups when I should have been the one to do it, but they made him do it instead. And he didn't really appreciate that. You know, the first place that I remember is that we lived on Division Street in Stevens Point. In fact, it was 401 Pine Street in Stevens Point. It was a two-story home, and at that time my father was working about 4 different jobs. And then along came the Depression, and we had to, he lost quite a bit of it, so we had to wind up in the country in a one-room log cabin. And our grandma came to live with us, and there was 8 of us living in this one-room log cabin, and it was difficult. All of us children slept in the, up in the loft, and Grandma and Mother and Dad slept on the first floor. We heated the house with a barrel, and we stuck 4-foot wood in the end of the stove. And when it would burn down so that he could shove the rest of the wood in, well, then it was time to go to bed. We lasted out there about 3 years, and then we moved back into town, and we rented a place on the Wisconsin River, and it was quite a nice place. And all the while we're doing this, Frank, at this time now, was old enough that he was doing a lot of artwork. And so we had a place for him to work with his artwork. Then we moved to a place on Wisconsin River that had 260 acres, and we were farming it. And in March, the house burnt down, so we moved a granary and an ice house together. And my brother and I, Charlie, did work on rebuilding it. We used cardboard in between the studs, and then a layer of lath, and then a layer of cardboard. That was our insulation. And then on top, the top of the studs, we used piano cartons. They were large, and they covered a large space on the wall. Then we wallpapered it. We had a small basement in it and a smokehouse beside the house. We had a barn, and of course we had horses, and we had cows. Frank spent a lot of his time with the horses. He was very, very apt with horses. We started a riding academy, and he took people out and taught them to ride and so on. From there, I left home, and I think Frank left home from there early and went away to school. And Charlie went to Arizona, and I went in the Army. In our really early days in the country out in the log cabin, we of course didn't have a well, so we had to dig a well, and we dug it all by hand and put rocks, rocked it all in. And then of course the well was over near the barn because that's where we needed the most water, and the barn was log also. It had a Buick car. When we went to the country, they took the body and made a chicken house out of it. They took the wheels and frame and made a wagon out of it, and then they took the motor and made a saw rig. They were very, very inventive. Then we raised potatoes, and of course Frank was taking the potatoes to the market, and he and his friend John Jones had potato sacks over their heads, and the horses ran away. That was a rather exciting experience for them. And then one of the other things that we'll always remember of that was that we were so short of food that they took barley and roasted it in the oven and used that for their coffee. And oftentimes we'd have popcorn and apples in the evening. It was really short, and of course we would take maple bark off of the maple trees, and Mother would cook it down with water and make maple syrup for pancakes. And we often had pancakes. In fact, that was almost a must. Every morning we had to have pancakes. Then, as we moved on through, we had a horse called Peanuts, and he was a cross between a Belgian and a Welsh pony. I don't know how that ever happened, but it happened. And he was very strong, and we used him for cultivating and used him for the cart and transportation. Then Dad had a team of called Dan and Dolly, and that's what they used for skidding wood out of the woods and skidding the pulpwood out and getting it out. Then it was shipped up to Weyerhaeuser. Then as we moved on into back into town, we raised corn, and we raised wheat, and we raised oats, and we raised quite a few other crops. But we didn't have tractors and stuff to do it with, so it meant that in the springtime it was always the plowing, and we'd plow with the team, and then after we plowed for the corn, and it had to be checked, and Dad was determined that it had to be right on the check so that you could get through with the cultivator. And then we had Peanuts on the cultivator, and we'd cultivate the corn through the summer and go to school at the same time in the fall and in the spring, I mean. And then, of course, we had potatoes, and there was the potatoes to harvest, and we had to harvest the potatoes, and they had to come in and go in the basement for the winter. And of course we picked a lot of blueberries and a lot of blackberries, and she would put them in the basement, and we'd have them for all winter. At that time, it was difficult for Mother to have more than $15 a month for groceries. So it was, she really knew how to handle it. One of the things that I'll never forget, and I have never been able to find out, she made a coffee cake that was flat. She'd make it in a large sheet pan, and she'd put raisins or any fruit she could get, and sour cream and sugar, and it was delicious. And I've tried and tried to get that recipe, but I've never been able to find anybody that has had it. What happened, it was the 17th of March, and it was mighty cold, about 20 below zero, and somehow or other the stove caught the house afire, and so we all had to get out into the weather, and of course we were all in our underclothes, and neighbors came and helped and wrapped us up to keep us warm enough to get to town, and they kept us for a few days until we could make arrangements for the family. The after that, we put a house together with a granary or a hog house and ice house. And we built it with the, put it together and filled in for insulation with cardboard, and then strips of lath, and then more cardboard, and built it up till we got to 2x4s filled in between the 2x4s, the studs, and then we had piano boxes, and we covered them completely. And we lived with friends of ours in Stevens Point for several months while we were building this unit. But it became very comfortable, and after that my father put ladders to all the upstairs windows so that in case of fire again we could get out through the windows, because we had a difficult time. A couple of the family had a difficult time getting out of the building because of the flame. This was, of course, during the Depression, and we had moved to the country. We were called squatters, and we lived in a one-room log house. And I can't think of the name right now of the person, but he was the person that brought food around, canned meat and stuff like that, for the people who didn't have anything to eat or needed help. That was, of course, during the Roosevelt time when they started CCCs and all those other organizations to help. But anyhow, the fellow got stuck that was delivering the food, and so I took Peanuts, which was a cross between a Belgian and a Welsh pony, and pulled him out. And when I pulled him out, why, then he asked me who I was and where I was from, and I told him. So he stopped at our house and left us 2 cases of meat. And of course, when my father found out about it, why, I had to get a whipping, because you don't accept stuff like that. There are other people that needed worse. Yes, that was when Blanche McNamara, Miss McNamara at that time, came out to visit me on my birthday on August 17th. And of course, my dad always sat out in a chair underneath the tree to make sure that all of us kids were working. And I was just up the hill a little ways, cutting brush, and Miss McNamara came up there, and she had brought me a softball to play with. And my dad saw that, and he came up and he took the softball away from me and threw it at her and told her his kids work, they don't play. And so, of course, from that time on, all the teachers in the school knew what kind of a character he was, and so for that reason I never learned to read or write, because they'd tell me, Donnie, lay your head down on the desk and rest. My typical day was we'd get up before daylight, have pancakes. Mother had sourdough pancakes every morning, and then after we had our breakfast, we'd go out and milk the cows and get the chores done, and then we'd go to school, and at noon I would be coming home to work in the field. Now the the way that the thing that happened in the morning was I would take the milk to the dairy with peanuts in the buggy and tie peanuts up behind the school while I went to class. And then after class, which is at noon, why I would go back home and then spend the afternoon and until dark working either cultivating or plowing, hand plow or drive hold the cultivator behind the horses to cultivate the corn and so on and so forth. And then of course it come time for chores, and then by the time we got done with the chores, it was about 8, 9 o'clock and time to go to bed. So we had very little time to study or work with that. I had asked Dad the day before if I could go to 4-H club camp. And he said yes. So I went. And after I was there for a few minutes, I rode my bike out there, and I had my leg in a cast because I had broken it. And I cut the cast at the knee so that I could move my leg and ride my bike. And I rode my bike out there. And when I got there, why, the county agent, Noble was his name, Mr. Noble, told me that my father had called and said that I was to get right home. So I started to leave, and Mr. Noble said, Donnie, you're going home, aren't you? And I said, yeah, I don't know. And then I decided I was going to go to California. So I got as far as La Crosse, just before La Crosse, and the front bearings went out on my bicycle. So at that point, a fellow came along with a pickup, and he saw me with having a little problem, so he had me put my bike in the back of his pickup and get in and go with him. He was going to take me to La Crosse to get the bearings, and he asked me if I had any money, and I said, no, I don't, but I'll get a job so that I can earn some to get the bearings for my bike. And he says, well, can you pitch bundles? Well, at that time you pitched the bundles into a shock and then came along later with the wagon and picked up the bundles. And so I worked there for about 2 weeks, and then my sister was in Rochester, Minnesota, nursing, and so I got a job there at a stationery store. And I had to go to school because one of the guys in charge, or that owned the stationery store, was superintendent of schools, and you had to go to school. So I went to school half a day there, and then the rest of the time I worked at the stationery store. And as I doing a job press, the old style job press where you put the card in, take it out, put a card in, take it out, to print cards, business cards and cards for funerals and so on. And then one day the old gentleman that repaired typewriters and office machines saw that I didn't have too much to do, so he asked me if I'd like to help him. So I went up to the front of the building and started working with him. And he said, now I'll take the typewriters apart, you clean them, and then I'll put them back together and adjust them. Okay, so that happened for a week. And then at the end of the week, he says, now, you take them apart and you clean them. Okay, So I did that. And a week or so later, he said, "Now, Donnie, you take them apart, clean them, put them back together, and I'll adjust them." So that went that way for a little while, and then he said, "Now you do the work, you finish them up." So I learned to adjust them and set the escapements and so on and get everything ready, which actually was one of the greatest things that ever happened in my life, because from then on I had it made. But then, when I came back from the South Pacific, I went to Bowling Army Air Base in Washington, D.C., and a typewriter repair shop. So I learned typewriters, adding machines, calculators, comptometers, denominators, the works. And so then I was sent to SAC headquarters, which was at Camp Springs Army Air Base, which is now Andrews Air Force Base, and in charge of the typewriter shop. In fact, they didn't have a typewriter shop before that. And then, as I worked in the typewriter shop, one day one of the Colonel McHugh came and asked me to if I would make a guest book for General Cuter. And General Cuter had a cottage up in the Poconos Mountains in Pennsylvania. So I was very fortunate. He introduced me to Dr. Van Cott at the Institute of Pathology in the temporary S buildings down on the down by the Washington Monument at the time, and he had a shop where they were building displays and stuff, and they allowed me to use the tools to make this guest book. Well, after I made the guest book and turned it over to the colonel to give to the general, then I became known in that level. And of course, then the rest of my military life, which was 27 years, was really nice. Then General Grove, who was the attorney or the Surgeon General of the War Department, asked me to build a display for him. So I built a display that filled the Hangar 1 at Bowling Field. And I had the old-fashioned movie projectors there and so on. And I borrowed the globe from the Senate office building and showed how the medical people worked around during the war. And from then on, why, I got two guys to teach to do the computers, and they set up a magnificent shop for me for building displays and exhibits. Well, one of the problems I run into there was that the ceiling in the place, in the shop that I was working in, was too low to set up my big displays. So I started looking for a Quonset hut that I could build in. And I went to, God, I can't think of the name now, Patuxent Naval Base, and I saw Commander Church, who I had met in South Pacific, and I asked him if he knew where I could get a hold of a Quonset hut. He says, yeah. He said, there's one up there on the hill. It's just in parts. It's never been put together. but he says, come on, we'll go up and look. So we went up there, and it was a hill, and he said, no, but it looks like there's a couple of them in there, so if you take one, you got to take them all. Okay. So then I found out that I went and got a truck from the engineers down near Haynes Point, and went to Patuxent to pick up the Quonset hut. And by the time I got done, I had 80 Quonset huts, and I had them out behind the trailer park at Andrews Air Force Base. And one day, the post commander, who was Colonel Nolan at that time, said, asked who was doing this, and he couldn't find out. And so then he went to the motor pool to find out who was drawing that truck out, and they said, well, that's Sergeant Jake. So then he found out that I worked for SAC headquarters at that time, and worked for the graphics department and run the office machines and changed all the locks and lock combinations and so on. And so then they called a meeting, and Colonel Thibault was in charge of the personnel part of the operation, and he said, Sergeant Jake, we got a meeting over at the base headquarters with Colonel Nolan. So I said, okay, and he told me the day, and that morning we went over there, we sat down, and Colonel Nolan says, well now, Sergeant Jacob, what where did you plan to put these Quonset huts? I said, well, the 4th Fire is not using the dispersing area anymore because they got the different area that they're working, so I was just going to set up a couple of rows of block and put those, they were actually Armco huts up there, and then that would give me the height that I needed for my displays, because I was building displays at that time for SAC headquarters, for bowling, and for a lot of different organizations. And when they got, after I told him what I'd planned to do, they sat there and discussed it a bit, and I said, well, Colonel Nolan says, well, Sergeant Jake, we'll look at this and let you know in a few days. So Colonel Thibault was with me, and he got up, he stood up, and he says, I think Sergeant Jake deserves the Legion of Merit for this operation. And we walked out, they all laughed, and we walked out. And 2 days later, they told me that, nope, it was off, couldn't do it. So Colonel Thibault called me in, and he says, what are we going to do? How are you going to get rid of those Quonset huts, or Armco huts? I said, well, I just happen to know the General Mack is in charge of the reserves, and they need buildings. And I said, I'll talk to him, and I said, I think the GCS needs some too. So I'll see what I can do. Well, it only took me a little while, and I got rid of all the buildings. But then they built a decent building for me with enough height to build the display. But that was an exciting time of my life. But that started from running away from home. And then, of course, come 1953, I decided to get out of service. After we got out of service, then I built a manufacturing home. We manufactured homes, and I sold 84 homes to places in Montana, Wyoming, North Dakota, and Idaho. We just manufactured the panels. They were prefabbed homes. You set them up and go. And one night I got drunk and I swapped the business because I was tired of it anyhow. I swapped the business for a hotel. And then I bought another hotel. So I had 2 hotels, but the one was one where people that didn't have anything lived. And if they couldn't pay their rent, like one of them couldn't pay his rent, so I said, that's all right, use the lobby and teach art. So my daughter was 13 years old, and she went to class, and she did one of the most magnificent drawings that anybody could imagine. And he taught all these people that wanted to learn artwork. It was tremendous. And that was the Grandin Hotel, and I have the picture of it. And that Grandin Hotel was a hotel that President, can't think of the name of him now, but he gave a speech from a tower on top of that building. And that's before they had anything but dirt roads. It was an old building. In fact, the elevator just had a fence around it. There weren't walls, just a fence so you couldn't step out in the hole. I guess I'm getting away from the subject that you want, the interest. But then, after I swapped and run the hotels, of course, I had lots of other houses and properties because I took them in from people who bought a house. Why, I pay them or give them credit for what they had. And so I have a lot of apartments and stuff. But then the President Johnson came into office, and we hit a bad time, and working capital was not there. You couldn't get working capital, so I about went broke, and I decided just to get out of it, and I got out of it, and the only thing that when we got out, it was $600 that I still owed a company that sold carpeting, and that's all I lost. And I just walked away from it. And I went to the culinary art school in New Haven, Connecticut, and called it the CIA, Culinary Institute of America. And I learned to cook. So then, one day I got a call from the Pentagon, and they said, Sergeant J, I was teaching the reserves. On Monday night I would teach reserves. So I was in the reserve, and I got the call, and they wanted to know if I had anybody that would like to cook for general officers as aides. They call them general aides. And so I sent them 2 people. And the day of graduation, when my wife and my daughter were to school to visit me and visit the graduation ceremony, I got another call. And he said they needed one more for a general at Fort Monroe, Virginia. And they wanted to know if I had another person that I could recommend or would go into service for that job. And I said, yes, I got one. They said, well, get his name and number and so on and so forth, and we'll see what we can do. I said, okay, his name is Don Jacobson. And his serial number was 34683486. Regular Army number. And of course, at that time, they were dealing with Social Security numbers. But I gave him that number to show him that I had been in service. He said, well, he said, I don't know whether we can use you because you have to be able to retire by the time you're 55. I said, well, I got 10.5 years in service, and I said I can retire by the time I'm 54. Oh, well, just let me call you back. So he went away and he called me back a few hours later and he said, when do you want to go on active duty? I said, last Friday. He said, okay, you're on. How about reporting to Fort Myers, Virginia on Monday? Okay, so I did. And from then on, I worked for either ambassadors or generals or admirals for the next 10 years. And it all was because I ran away from home and learned to fix computers, or typewriters.
So that was...
See, and Peanuts, the horse that we had, was a cross between that and a Welsh pony.
So Belgian and a Welsh pony.
Yeah, and how in the world those two animals could have gotten together to breed is phenomenal.
It's a mystery.
Pony stud, breeding an animal like that? Or can you imagine that animal breeding Welsh pony? It just seems impossible.
Would it feel good or be painful?
Well, I don't know whether, I don't know, I never tried it.
This is the modern way?
That's the modern way, rolling it. What we used to do is rake it and shock it and then throw it on a wagon and load the wagon with hay, hook the horses onto it and pull it to the barn. And then use the hay fork, put the fork down in the hay, lift it up, put it up in the barn for the winter. I met my wife in a kind of a peculiar way. I was coming down the road with a load of hay to take to our house, and of course, you know, in those days our mothers always made our underclothes out of flour sacks. And the flour sacks were usually decorated with flowers and so on and so forth. And she had, her underwear was made out of a flour sack. She was out picking beans with her mother, and the wind blew her dress up and it says Pillsbury's Best. And I said, that's for me. I met her in high school. Later, we were in the same class, and of course it was difficult for me because some of the guys were a little larger than I was, but I had to pick them up and put them in a different seat because I was going to sit beside her. And I did all right. I was always beside her, and she's been beside me ever since. She's been with me all over the world. She's been with me in many parts in the United States, and she has been a godsend to me. I think that I don't think there's anything more that she could have done for me or given me any more support than she had. We worked for generals and ambassadors around the world, and she was always there to support me. If the general and his wife were off to the United States or someplace, why she'd take the children to church. And I'll never forget the one day on Mother's Day, she took little Tommy to church. Tommy had a flower for her, and when they asked him why, he said, well, this is his mother for the day. And that was a wonderful thing. To keep heat in the house, we would put 4 feet of horse manure around the house, around the log cabin, and that would heat during the winter. Now, we use horse manure because it heats, and it don't make any difference how cold it gets. You'll always see steam coming from the pile of horse manure. But cow manure, on the other hand, is digested better, and what happens is it freezes and it becomes solid.